Jim Bridger Biography, Part 3. The next few years were spent by Bridger in the employ of the American Fur Company, trapping throughout that section of territory west of the Bighorn River. Numerous thrilling escapes from hostile savages were encountered. As a trapper, Bridger's work seems to have ceased about 1843, or at the time when the historic Fort Bridger was built. This point became a noted one on the line of overland travel for many years, Bridger selecting the spot because it would bring him in much revenue from the immigrants. The Mormon Trail also was close at hand, and the North and South Platte routes met near Fort Bridger, thus making the place an important one to all travelers. Here, Bridger established a blacksmith shop, supply store, and a trading post, and as most of the immigrants were well supplied with money, and were moreover generally obliged to purchase provisions and supplies about the time they reached Fort Bridger, considerable business was transacted. Of this post, Bridger says in a letter to Pierre Chouteau in December 1843, doubtless written by someone else as Bridger never learned to write, "I have established a small fort with a blacksmith shop and a supply of iron in the road of the immigrants on Black Fork of Green River, which promises fairly well. They, in coming out, are generally well supplied with money, but by the time they get here are in want of all kinds of supplies. Horses, provisions, smithwork, etc. bring ready cash from them, and should I receive the goods ordered hereby, we'll do a considerable business that way with them. The same establishment trades with the Indians in the neighborhood, who have mostly a good number of beaver among them." It is quite apparent, however, that Bridger did not spend all his time at his fort, but made frequent trapping expeditions into the mountains, as in the fall of 1844. He led a trapping party to Milk River, having received reports that beaver were plentiful along that stream. His party consisted of 30 picked men. The trapping was a failure, however, and in November, the party arrived at Fort Union, where they spent the winter. Bridger was well known to Laidlaw, who was in charge of the fort at the time, and made his camp about half a mile distant from the post. And Bridger was greatly disappointed over the failure of his trapping expedition, but the inmates of the fort were relieved at the appearance of his outfit, concluding now that with such a formidable party encamped close at hand, the danger of an Indian attack was greatly lessened. Bridger appears to have regaled the fort officials with wonderful tales of his prowess. The main substance of Bridger's conversation was his brave men, his fast horses, and his fights with the Blackfeet, till we were induced to believe that there would be no danger for us in case of an attack by the Sioux. That's in quotes. However, for once, Bridger appears to have relaxed his vigilance. Shortly before the latter part of December, Indians stampeded the horse herd belonging to the fort. 6 animals were stolen, and one of the herders was wounded in the leg. Bridger's party was called upon to recapture the stolen animals and punish the thieves. The Indians were pursued to the base of a high hill, upon which they made a stand. Here they taunted their pursuers and dared them to come and fight. Bridger's men, however, concluded that discretion was the better part of valor and refused to attack the Indians, greatly to the disgust and the mortification of Bridger, who was unable to account for their cowardice. In vain did he attempt to rally them to the charging point. Not a man would attempt to scale the hill. After jeering at the trappers and daring them to come up the hill and give battle, the savages leisurely took their departure, having killed 1 man, and decamping with all the stolen stock. So chagrined was Bridger over Bridger's fort has well been characterized as a veritable oasis in the desert, and most excellent judgment was shown on the part of the founder in establishing his headquarters in such a favored spot. Bridger obtained the land from the Mexican government before it became a part of the United States. Here he lived, spasmodically it is true, until 1857, when he leased the property to the United States for the sum of $600 per year, which rental, by the way, never was paid, and 30 years passed before the government finally paid Bridger $6,000 for the improvements he had made to the property, but not a cent for the land itself. Indeed, his rights were totally ignored. A description of Fort Bridger is interesting here. Sunday morning, June 17, 1849, an hour or so before noon, we came to Fort Bridger, situated on Black's Fork at the foot of the Utah Mountains, which loom up grandly above the beautiful fertile valley surrounding this trading post, one of the most attractive spots thus far seen. Jogging on in advance of the train, by the time the wagons came up, I had made an inspection of the fort besides taking a rest. There are several log buildings surrounded by a high picket fence and having a heavy wooden entrance gate. The owners of the fort are Major James Bridger, an old mountaineer who for the past 30 years has been engaged in trading with the Indians about the headwaters of the Missouri and Columbia rivers, and Colonel Vasquez, whom we met beyond the South Pass, as already related. In company with Mr. Scully, I visited several of the apartments of the fort, among others the rooms occupied by the families of the proprietors, through which we were conducted by Mrs. Vasquez, who entertained us in an agreeable and hospitable manner, notably by inviting us to sit upon chairs, a situation somewhat novel, one to which for some time past we had not been accustomed. Opening upon a court where the rooms occupied by the Bridger family, Mr. Bridger, with a taste different from that of his partner, who has a white wife from the States, made his selection from among the ladies of the wilderness, a stolid, fleshy, round-headed woman, not oppressed with lines of beauty. Her hair was intensely black and straight, and so cut that it hung in a thick mass upon her broad shoulders. Excuse me. In a corner of Mrs. Bridger's room was a churn filled with buttermilk, and dipping from it with a ladle formed from a gourd, Mrs. Vasquez filled and refilled our cups, which we drank until completely satisfied. It chanced that we were enabled to repay the kindness shown by this lady without the least sacrifice on our part, a fact to be regretted. In the course of conversation, when speaking of the comforts of which she was deprived by living so far from the haunts of civilization, Mrs. Bridger mentioned the loss of a skillet lid and her inability thus far to replace it. It was curious that it should be so, but such was the fact that we were the owners of the identical article coveted. Our skillet had been fractured and thrown away, but with that particular inclination which many possess of clinging to articles that have become wholly useless, we had treasured that skillet lid, and now, in the briefest possible time, even before one could say Jack Robinson, it was transferred to Mrs. Bridger's kitchen. 50 skillet lids would not have been worth the smile which greeted us when making our presentation speech, and it was plain that it was altogether useless to attempt to get out of debt. As we turned to leave, a still further burden was placed upon us when we were given a roll of freshly churned butter of a rich golden yellow and glistening, as it were, with drops of dew.